are in Chapter 8, Political Parties. This is a fantastic unit to do right now. I'm going to imagine in the next 2 weeks, there's actually going to be a lot of discussion about political parties. If you know anything about current events, there are a number of there are 2 Republican candidates who are threatening to leave the Republican Party. One we've known about, Donald Trump has sort of made many motions to that. Last week on Friday, Ben Carson came out and said that he was going to leave the Republican Party. They couldn't get their act together. We will see. It would be the first in a very long time of a traditional political party candidate branching out and going somewhere else. It would mean a huge change in the political spectrum of this campaign. Oh, I gotta get that out there. Okay, so first, before we talk about these 3 components of a party, we need to sort of talk about what political parties are. First thing I need you to write down, I need you to know this. There is nowhere in the Constitution that details political parties. Our founders did not envision our governmental system to be divided by parties. There's nothing mentioned about parties. However, once we get into the history, you're going to realize that it did not take long for parties to emerge. Political parties are made up of people who use organization, resources, and access to power that the parties provide in order to influence the outcomes of government. They are a structure of government used to make some influence. We call these factions. Think back to when we did Federalist 10, and they talked about factions and divides. This is essentially what we're talking about here. They are not interest groups. Please, please, please make sure that you understand that a political party is very different than an interest group. As we get going, they're going to start to feel very similar. They're very different. Interest groups don't operate government, political parties do. Okay, so political parties actually have some power in the day-to-day operations of government. Who is the majority leader? Who's the minority leader? Who are the party whips? How do votes get called? Who is assigned to committees? How does the president and Congress work together if we're in a divided government? Interest groups influence government. They do not operate in government. Political parties operate government in many different influence or interests. Okay, getting organized. The 3 components of a party. So you need to know each 3 of these. If you're able to use them in an FRQ, you're certainly going to be able to show some advanced knowledge. So party and the electorate. Oh, wait, I'm so sorry. I'm going to backtrack for a second. We need to talk about political party functions before we get started. They have 5 main functions. Your book is going to outline them. First is that they recruit candidates to run for political office under their party label. So one of the functions of political parties is to get people involved in politics because they'll pull people from their party and encourage them to run.
What was that one?
Recruiting candidates to run for political office under their party label. Number 2 is organizing and running elections. Political parties do a lot in making our elections happen. They get people out to door, get out the vote campaigns, making sure people are registered, making sure people are educated, making sure people know that it's voting day. They actually do a lot to organize and run elections. Number 3, present alternative policies to the electorate. Having political parties allows new ideas. It allows you to choose different people based on your ideas. So it presents alternative policies to the electorate, which is us. People who can vote, actually, so it's not really you. Number 4 is accepting responsibility for operating the government. Political parties have to accept responsibility when government doesn't run well, or when they do run well, they'll definitely take responsibility for it. Because our party system is so large, it's so vast, it's so influential, When government fails, parties fail. When parties fail, government fails.
Okay, so if you're having
They're
trouble
very
with,
hand in hand.
start with the
And then the last one is acting as the organized opposition to the party in power. That's one of the functions of political parties, is that if you are not in power, it is your job as the opposing party to stay active, to stay vocal, to make sure that people who agree with you as opposed to the majority still have people that they can access for help and for ideas. It's important that parties, regardless of where they are, majority or minority, that they continue to stay active. Okay, now we're on to the three components of a party. So this is party in the electorate, party organization, and party in government. Party in the electorate, this means that parties are made up of all people who affiliate and identify with a political party. So party in the electorate means that we have political parties in our everyday lives. It's not just people in government who say, I am a Republican, or I am a Democrat, or I am an independent. Party in the electorate means that we've now branched our political parties into everyday society. That it is very typical for people your age to start identifying with a party. Now, sometimes that's a good thing, sometimes that's a bad thing. It's a good thing because we have people who are being aware of government, who are participating in government. It's a bad thing because we start to see this greater divide happen. We as an American society love to divide ourselves. We love to put separations between each other, and political parties are a huge piece of that. Party organization. So we're going to go a little bit further into the second piece here and how they organize, which is party organization. The biggest piece of party organization is what we call, party organization provides the structural framework for the political party. So it's sort of how are parties structured, how do they run day to day. First piece here is the National Convention. The National Convention is a really big deal for extreme party members. For most people, the conventions for the parties don't actually matter very much because they're kind of the extreme side of the party, and many people don't usually identify with the extreme side of the party. The National Convention is held every 4 years. It's attended by thousands. The convention is also attended by delegates from each state. So we'll talk a little bit about that. But convention delegates kind of represent their state. The president and vice presidential candidates are officially nominated, and delegates adopt the party platform. So this is where they get together, they decide, here's what the Democratic Party believes in. Here's what the Republican Party believes in. They write it out, they publish their party platform. Now, are there a lot of surprises? No. We usually typically know what the party platform is. However, sometimes we've seen party platforms coming out of conventions that start to tailor themselves toward different groups of people, and that can sometimes help them in that final push, especially towards a presidential election. Each of the parties chooses a national committee at this convention. They're elected by individual state parties, and they are designed to direct and coordinate party activities during the following 4 years. So they elect who their chairperson is going to be for the next 4 years, who is going to be on some of these deciding committees. It's a pretty big deal. In 2016, we have both of the conventions. They have been every 4 years during the year that a new president would be elected. So the last one was in 2012. This one is in 2016. If you want to know, Democratic National Convention is going to be held in Philadelphia. It's held in the spring. And then the Republican National Convention is going to be held in Cleveland this year. They typically try to find cities that need support. Having a national convention in a specific city certainly helps economic gain. There's a lot of people traveling in. It's sort of like a mini Olympics, sort of. It really helps the city economically for a little while. because people are there and they're spending money and they're highlighting some of the pieces of the city that they choose. Okay, state party organization. This can vary state to state. So there isn't like an ideal model for a state party organization. What we typically see is that there's a chairperson, so the Wisconsin State Democratic chairperson or the Wisconsin State Republican chairperson. There's typically an organized committee that makes decisions on funding and campaigning and platform, advertising, things like that. And then we also have local organizations. State parties are important in national politics because of this unit rule, which is a rule by which all states' electoral votes are cast for the presidential candidate. So it's important that the state parties are organized, that they effectively sort of educate the people of their state, because it really does matter when it comes to presidential elections. Please remember that in the Electoral College, when the majority of your state has decided, all of your state's delegates go to that party except for 2 states. Maine and Nebraska do not operate that way, but in all other states, it's really important that a state party is organized, because if they lose, then they lose all of those electoral votes to the presidential candidate. Local party organizations, they're really not very strong. They're not really meant to influence government. They're more meant as a place for people to come together and feel like they're connected in their party affiliation. So local party organizations are a little bit more for the people and less for the specific government. We do see some patronage. Patronage is a term I need you to know. It's rewarding the party faithful with government jobs and contracts. This is why a lot of local party organizations stay together. They can often kind of move up the ladder through the patronage system. So if I organize a Democratic rally in, Rock County and I do really well, sometimes the party will reward me by giving me a role somewhere else, and then I can get a role somewhere else, and I can sort of build myself up through the party. This is what a national convention looks like. I played with showing you some speeches. National conventions also serve as a really good way for potential future candidates in the party to be highlighted. Pay attention to who speaks in the 2016 conventions. Odds are good that you're going to see them again. In 2004, Barack Obama was asked to speak at the Democratic National Convention, and it was sort of the kickoff point for him to be in national politics. The speech that he gave in 2004 is probably one of the best speeches Barack Obama has ever given. I play it for my American government students now because it really highlights some pieces of government that are important. At the time, John Kerry was running, and so he kind of talked a little bit about John Kerry, but he also talked about his personal politics. Mitt Romney has given some pretty big speeches, things like that. So if you get a chance, watch some of them. They are really nice glimpses into what the party will look like in the next few years. Okay, party in government. So we've moved from party in the electorate to the party organization. Now we're on to party in government. So what does the party look like when we're talking about in government institutions? We've had a 2-party system for a great deal of time. And so that's going to matter here when we talk about what it looks like in government. We have a concept called divided government. We are in a divided government right now. Okay, divided government means that the legislative branch and the executive branch are not in the same party. Okay, so the legislative branch right now is run by a majority of Republicans, and our executive branch is run by a Democratic president. This means that in a divided government, our government will slow way down. And essentially that's because people in Congress need to vote with their party, the president needs to vote with his party. Obviously, they're not going to agree very well. However, we do see a concept called ticket splitting where we see the electorate, people who vote, tend to actually favor the idea of divided government in the sense that it causes, some debate. It causes things to slow down. Ticket splitting is when you vote for candidates of two or more parties for different offices. So for example, a voter splits her ticket if she votes for a Republican presidential candidate and a Democratic congressional candidate. You see this happen a lot. Two things why this is interesting. First, hopefully, it's a glimpse into the idea that voters are voting based on the ideals and campaigns of the people who are running, as opposed to the party name behind their name. We want people to be ticket splitting in the sense that we want people to be voting for the candidate, not the party, okay? We'll talk a little bit about that later. The second thing is that when we ticket split, we're sort of acknowledging that the divided government system is a nice check in the sense of legislative work. When we see a legislative branch that's in the same party as the executive branch, bills get passed really quickly, and sometimes things aren't debated or analyzed as well as they probably could be. Limits of party unity. There are some limits to how parties will unify, how they're allowed to unify. Your book goes into this in more detail, so I'm going to let your book do this rather than me lecture about it. And then party polarization. This is, what we really talk about today when we talk about political parties. That the parties are starting to focus way more on the things they differ as opposed to the things that they share. And so what we see is this party polarization, where if I say I'm a Republican and someone says they're a Democrat, I can go ahead and disagree with absolutely everything that they say. That wasn't always the case. We used to have party, divides that were a little easier to bridge the gap. That's becoming much more difficult to do. And it's getting kind of entrenched in this idea of safe seats. This is where a district returns the legislator with 55% of the vote or more. And this is where we talk about gerrymandering. When we change district lines to favor a political party, we send the same legislator to our legislative branch every single time. That becomes a problem because we've started to notice that we have fewer and fewer seats up for change when it comes to a midterm or a presidential election. So what that means is that our legislative branch isn't changing very much. There are about 18 seats that are truly up for grabs anymore. And that's pretty incredible. With a legislative branch as large as ours is, to only have about 18 districts that are truly up for grabs means that there's not going to be a whole lot of change. And as that continues to become more and more entrenched, the more and more you're going to see the legislative branch not get much done because there won't be as much change during these re-election periods. Okay, a history of the political parties. This is important to know. I'm going to go through it kind of briefly. Tomorrow we're going to watch a crash course video where he's going to go through it a little bit more in depth. And then you're going to do an assignment on Wednesday that's going to sort of make a timeline for yourself on what the party system really looks like. The first party system is developed 1789, 1828 is like the first era that we really talk about. And this is Federalists and Anti-Federalists. So right as we see the Constitution be ratified, we see two parties emerge. Federalists who support a strong national government, Anti-Federalists who are against that strong national government. The Federalists included John Adams. They represented the commercial interests such as merchants, large planters, and those who are very similar to the founders. Well-educated landowners, kind of the elite. Anti-Federalists, made up of people like Thomas Jefferson. They came to be called the Republicans. They represented artisans and farmers. They strongly supported states' rights. So again, sort of a lower middle class party, more of the common people push there. Okay, now we move into what we call the era of good feelings. This is from 1800 to about 1820. Actually, change that to 1817 to 1825. Essentially, it's when James Monroe is president, and there's very little political opposition. They call it the era of good feelings because once we had adopted the Bill of Rights and sort of put in some of the civil liberties, there isn't a great deal of partisanship here. Both of the parties tend to agree. James Monroe is a pretty good president at sort of bridging the gap, making sure that he addresses to both of the parties. The second party system is the emergence of Democrats and Whigs, and this is 1828 to 1860. Organized two-party politics returns at about 1824. The followers of John Adams call themselves National Republicans. So John Adams is a National Republican. And the followers of Andrew Jackson, who ended up defeating Adams in 1828, formed the Democratic Party. I'll say that again. The followers of Andrew Jackson, who defeated Adams in 1828, formed the Democratic Party. Later, the National Republicans are going to turn into Whigs. They're going to kind of rename their organization to the Whig Party, which stood for federal spending on internal improvements such as roads. Where the Democrats are the stronger of the two parties, but they favor personal liberty and the opportunity for the common man. Again, we're going to go through this history again more in depth, actually twice. Tomorrow you're going to watch a video, Wednesday you're going to play with it a little bit. What you need to understand is that, and you hopefully know this by now, our political parties have switched sides multiple times. People who will say, I am a Republican and our Republican is strong in their history and what they believe in. They're actually not. Democrats and Republicans have switched policies a number of times. First is with slavery, second is with the Great Depression. It's a good thing because it means the parties are constantly trying to evolve and change and attract more electors and voting members. But it also means that the history of political parties isn't like rich in what it has always stood for. It hasn't always stood for the same things. Okay, now we move to a third party system. This is the Republicans' rise to power in the Civil War. So just like I mentioned, in the era of slavery, things sort of get turned on their head. Slavery between the North and South divides both parties. So both parties can't really decide how they want to address the issue of slavery, whether they want to be in favor or opposed to it. Northern Democrats fear a strong government. Republicans thought that government should promote business and economic growth. And so we're still seeing this divide. This is called Romanism and rebellion. It's the idea that Northern Democrats are favoring strong government and Republicans believe that government should sort of promote business and economic growth. And then we see the triumph of Republicans. This happens from 1896 to 1932. And the Republicans are successfully able to present themselves as the party that knew how to manage the economy. So they see a great deal of success from 1896 to 1932. Notice 1932, we're going to hit the Great Depression and things are going to switch again. So what you really need to know here is that during the Civil War era, Republicans are actually the more favored organization than the Democrats. And Republicans are more in favor of allowing slaves to vote and having their voice. Democrats are a lot less in favor of that. Okay, fourth party system. So they divide it into eras is what we're essentially doing. And this is what they call the progressive interlude and Republican dominance. So this is the 1896 to 1932. It's a pretty quiet era in the sense that Republicans tend to dominate many of these political elections. Progressivism is this idea It's a spirit compounded by a fear of growing power of great corporations and a belief that honest, impartial government could regulate the economy effectively. So then we move on to the fifth party system. And again, I know this seems like a lot, it seems like a kind of confusing situation. Hopefully the video tomorrow and the activities will help a little bit. This is where we see the New Deal, and then we see Democratic dominance. And essentially 16 years of that really comes from FDR. The Republican ascendancy ended in the election of 1932. Herbert Hoover, who was a Republican, was president during the 1929 stock market crash, and he doesn't do very well at helping the country survive it. He believes that the economy will even itself out. He believes that if governments keeps their hands off of intervening, that the economy will bounce back. People sort of believe him, but then by 1932, during the presidential election, they would like something else. They would like a new idea. And that's when FDR steps in and has this great plan to sort of really get government's hands involved in economy and turn things around, essentially. The Great Depression shatters the working class belief in Republican economic competence. So Republicans start to look very weak in the idea of managing the country's economic situation. And so we see FDR come in, and he really changes the Democratic Party to go from a party that really believes in the common man and sort of letting people be, to getting involved and really getting government into a lot of areas, expanding government to be larger than we'd ever seen it, to deal with a lot of issues that most people would have assumed that government should have gotten involved in. And so now we've got we call this the post-party system era. It's 1968 to the present. And this is where we see red states and we see blue states. It's this idea that since 1968, our parties are starting to, well, and again, this is a really tricky time from 2000 to 2015, are starting to sort of regulate themselves and stay very where they want to be. There's not a lot of changes. However, I will argue and say that by 2000, we sort of ended this post-party system era, and we're starting kind of a new idea here in the sense that we have Latino voters, we have LGBT voters, who are demographics that don't have a specific party. And so the parties are kind of getting out of their castes, if you will, and trying to tailor their party to bring in some of these new voters. And so that's why we see a lot of debate going on, especially in this presidential election, because the parties are trying to figure out what they have to say and what they have to do to attract more voters. It's why Donald Trump is saying some of the things he's saying, because part of it is that we have a great deal of electorate who votes based on fear. He's going to try and appeal to those voters and bring them to the Republican Party side. I think the Republican Party was sort of okay with it until last week, where we're starting to see the Republican Party get a little nervous about how far he's going to appeal to the people who are voting in fear. But it's effective. It's why he's doing so well in the polls. We have a great deal of the voting electorate who votes based on fear, based on the idea of, I am afraid of ISIS and I am afraid of all of these things. How are you going to fix it? You can't argue with Donald Trump that the policy of, some of the policies that he's proposing would help that. Whether or not it's legal or appropriate is up to, personal interpretation. That's what he's doing. Partisan trends in the 2012 election, African American voters, women, low-income voters, union voters, and Latino voters gave the president the majority of their votes. That's why he won. He was able to win some of these groups of people who historically haven't had a specific party to go to. Women have gone from the Republican Party to the Democratic Party multiple times. African Americans still, kind of move. It depends on where they live, things like that. Lower income voters, union voters, and Latino voters. Latino voters, we talked about this before. They're going to be really important. They're going to be really important in the 2016 election. They may very well decide who the president is, because at this point, the Latino population, if they can get the vote, if they can get out and get Latinos to go vote, it could mean a great deal of change in our party politics.
Oh, it's in Rio.
So this is where we see the presidential election of 2012. So the numbers that you see under the states, those are the electoral votes. Electoral votes are your House of Representatives, the number of representatives you have in the House, plus your senators. So we have 8 representatives plus 2 senators, which means that Wisconsin holds 10 electoral votes. Remember that it's not popular vote, it's electoral vote. So if you look at the map and you look at it really fast, you think, oh, Republicans won because you see more red. Well, Mitt Romney won states that don't have large electoral votes other than Texas. And so he wasn't able to get the number of votes that he needed. He only received 206 electoral votes. So you'll notice that President Obama wins California, Florida, Ohio, Illinois. Those would probably be the biggest state. Pennsylvania is pretty big. And so between those states alone, he's able to get a huge number, whereas Mitt Romney has to win, many, many more votes. It's the process of the Electoral College. It's the idea that you're going to see presidential elections going to the states that have the largest electoral votes, as opposed to states like Montana and Wyoming, because they have to win twice as many of those to sort of make up for what they'll miss in the rest of the country. So it's something to think about. Again, remember that red states and blue states mean that all of our electoral votes go to one candidate, other than Nebraska and Maine. But I think in the 2012 presidential election, they ended up going in specific places.
About as much people in the lights as in lights.
There's more people in the last. There's like 6 people in Alaska.
Bunch of players. Like 2 or 3 people. I just want to there's nobody over there.
Not yet.
Wyoming has like less people in it than Madison.